Nathan Gray left home on a rainy Friday and never looked back. He didn't slam the door, didn't leave a note, just packed his things, tossed a box of old tools in the back of his pickup, and drove off. He didn't know where he was going that night, only that it had to be far from the woman he'd loved for half his life. The woman who, in a single moment, made him feel like a stranger in his own house. There was no yelling. When he saw Liz with someone else, he just stood there, watched the man walk off the back porch. She opened her mouth to speak, but by then Nathan was already at the front door, walking out without a word, without a glance behind. From that moment on, his voice disappeared from her world, just as her face vanished from his morning thoughts. 10 years passed. Years that turned him into someone he'd never imagined he'd become. He lived out of a van, took odd jobs here and there, roofing, carpentry, anything that kept his hands busy. There was enough money to live quietly. He didn't drink, didn't get close to anyone, never held eye contact longer than necessary. He liked the silence best, morning silence, before the world woke up, evening silence, when the town was already asleep. That's where he hid himself, in the quiet. One autumn evening, when the leaves were falling and the air smelled damp, he opened the rusted mailbox outside a roadside motel in Oregon. Inside was a single envelope. The handwriting wasn't Liz's, it was a woman's, but unfamiliar. There were just a few lines inside. "I'm sorry to reach out like this. Liz is very sick. She wants to see you. If you can come, please do. Williford, River Lane Hospice." Nathan sat with that letter in his hands until it turned damp from his palms. He didn't get angry. He didn't cry. He just sat still while the night wrapped itself around him. He wasn't sure if the message truly came from Liz or if someone had made a mistake. But something inside him, something buried deep, stirred. Not like pain, more like a faint light rising up from the dark. The next morning, he filled his tank, checked the tire pressure, and drove toward the one place he swore he'd never return. Williford greeted him with fog and damp wind, carrying the scent of river water and wetwood. The town looked much the same: narrow streets, old lampposts casting soft yellow halos, and a hush that always seemed to hide behind weathered shop signs. Nathan pulled into a small motel near the center. He paid for 3 nights without saying how long he planned to stay. When asked why he was in town, he simply said, "Visiting an old friend." The hospice on River Lane was a 2-story house with white shutters and a garden already littered with fallen leaves. Inside, it smelled of apples, fresh linens, and something faintly medicinal. A middle-aged woman with a tired but kind face met him at the door. She didn't ask questions, just said, "Liz is in her room. Second door on the left." He walked slowly, like wading into deep water. Stopped at the doorway. The room was dim, lit only by a bedside lamp casting a warm glow across the wall where a few old photographs hung. Liz was wrapped in a blanket. Thin, pale, but the lines of her face were still the same, the ones he'd once known like the back of his hand. She saw him right away, as if she'd been waiting for this very moment. There was no shock, no gasp, just a quiet smile, the kind that comes after a long, long sleep. He sat beside her, not touching, not speaking. Minutes passed. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I was afraid you wouldn't come." He didn't answer. There was nothing he needed to say. The silence between them held more than words ever could. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't talk about the past. She spoke of the trees outside, the changing leaves, the way tea no longer tasted the same. And he listened. And he stayed. When the nurse came in to give her an injection, Liz turned to him and said softly, "Come back tomorrow, if you can. I sleep easier when you're here." That evening, Nathan stood by the river for a long time. The water moved slow. The lights shimmered across its surface. He still didn't know why he'd come, but he was glad he did. On the 3rd day, Williford felt just a bit warmer. The air smelled of wood smoke. Someone must have been burning leaves outside town. Nathan arrived earlier than usual. The nurse smiled when she saw him and said Liz had slept a little better that night. There was no cheer in her voice, just quiet gratitude, the kind people speak with when words are scarce. He stepped into the room and placed a thermos of coffee on the table, a habit he hadn't been able to break. Liz was sitting up against the pillows, a blanket over her legs, a book resting in her hands. When she saw him, she set it gently on her lap. They didn't speak right away. That had become their unspoken agreement. No explanations, no questions, just presence. Liz began to talk about the years that had passed. Not about what had gone wrong or what couldn't be changed, but the small things. How she'd fallen in love with painting even though she was never good at it. How she learned to make pumpkin soup. How she found comfort in an old park just outside town. She spoke as if she were reading a journal out loud, not for him, but for herself. Nathan sat beside her, listening. It didn't hurt anymore. And that feeling, the absence of pain, confused him the most. His heart hadn't raced in years. But with her, it didn't ache either. When her voice grew tired, he stood and opened the window. The crisp autumn air drifted in, filled with the scent of damp wood and distant smoke. Liz smiled and said it reminded her of fishing, that first time when they had just begun their life together. He remembered. And he smiled too. Not because it was funny, but because memory has its own way of touching you, a soft, invisible hand that reaches from the past. When Nathan left the hospice, he sat for a long time on a bench beneath the pine tree. The sky above was wide and empty. Autumn smelled like smoke, and memory like silence that doesn't hurt. The next day, Nathan walked slowly. The night hadn't been sleepless, it had just been full. Something inside him had stirred again. Memories he'd kept locked away for years no longer obeyed. Liz's face, worn and calm, blurred together with that evening, the one when he walked away from home. But instead of anger, something else had come. Something he didn't fully trust. He wasn't sure if it was weakness or forgiveness. She was waiting for him, wearing a pale nightgown. There was fatigue in her eyes, but no fear. She asked him to sit closer, as if afraid she might not get another chance to see him. She told him her nights had grown quieter since he'd come back. Then, without preface or ceremony, she said, "I made a mistake. And it wasn't about love or passion. I just lost myself. And I lost you." Nathan didn't speak. He hadn't come to revisit that night, but she had opened the door to it. Liz didn't try to justify what happened. Her voice carried no excuses, only the calm of someone who had stopped being afraid because they knew there was no time left. "I saw the way you looked at me that night," she whispered. "It wasn't hate. It was silence. And that scared me the most. You didn't leave out of anger. You left because killing love is worse than betrayal." He reached for her hand, gently, as if it might break. She didn't look away. "I forgave you," he said. "A long time ago. I just didn't know what for." That night, Nathan didn't return to the motel. He stayed in his truck, parked beside the hospice, listening to the rain on the roof. In his hands was an old journal, one he'd kept before life fell apart. The pages were yellowed. The words felt like someone else's. He took out his lighter and burned it right there in the lot. Not in anger, but because he no longer needed to go back. Nathan arrived as a heavy fog settled over Williford. The pines outside the hospice looked as if someone had painted them in blurred strokes. It was quiet. Too quiet. The nurse who opened the door didn't speak. She just gave him a small nod, the kind people give when words are no longer needed. Liz lay still. Her face looked almost translucent, drained of color, but there was still a flicker of light in her eyes. When she saw him, she offered the faintest smile. Nathan sat beside her. He had brought a small bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind she loved back when they first went fishing outside of town. She had picked some like these near the water and tucked them into her hair. He placed the flowers on the table, and she looked at them longer than she looked at him. They talked again, not about what was happening, but about what was still alive inside them. The little things. The taste of morning coffee. The smell of old books. The crack in the ceiling of their first house. There was no fear in her voice. Only quiet tiredness. And peace. When she grew too tired to speak, Nathan read aloud from one of her favorite books. She closed her eyes, listening, and somewhere deep inside, it felt like she smiled. Not with her lips, but with something even deeper. When he stopped reading, she opened her eyes again and looked at him. For a long time, like someone who'd just found something they thought was gone forever. After lunch, she drifted to sleep. Easily, gently, as if she were only resting. The nurse, closing the door behind her, whispered, "She's never slept this peacefully since she came here." Nathan stepped outside. The fog had started to lift. The trees stood clearer now. He sat on the same bench as always, staring at the sky. In his pocket, his fingers found an old button from a shirt Liz had once sewn for him by hand. He smiled. There was nothing left in the past but memories. But maybe that was enough. Liz passed at dawn. No words, no goodbye. The nurse said she lay peacefully through the night, with the faintest smile on her lips, as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment. To leave quietly, with nothing left to carry. When Nathan walked into the room, everything had already been tidied up. The bed was made. The lights were off. Only one thing remained, a small box on the table, his name written on it. Inside was a photo, an old snapshot from years ago, taken in the backyard of their home. They were both laughing, wrapped in each other's arms under the golden light of sunset. There was also a necklace she used to wear every day. And a letter, the handwriting shaky, but hers. I've spent days thinking about what to say. And I finally realized too many words might only ruin it. I remember every morning you made coffee, even when we were angry. I remember how you quietly fixed things when all I wanted was to run away. I remember how we loved. I made mistakes. You didn't owe me anything. But you came back. And somehow, that made it all lighter. Our house. Yes, our house. I never threw anything of yours away. Everything stayed where you left it all these years. Because deep down, I hoped one day you might forgive me. Or at least try. You don't have to run anymore. Stay. Stay in the town that knows us. Stay in the home we built. Keep the best memories of us. I hope you can forgive me. Thank you for being with me at the end. I'm leaving at peace. Nathan sat for a long time, holding the letter. He didn't cry. His eyes stayed dry, but somewhere deep inside, something let go. Like breath that had been held for far too long. He returned to the house. To stay, he brought with him a small bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind she'd always loved. He placed them in a glass vase on the windowsill, where he used to leave flowers just for her. Inside, almost nothing had changed. The same books, the same picture frame on the nightstand, even the old blanket she used to curl up in. As if time had simply paused, waiting for him. Nathan walked through the room slowly. He touched the back of her favorite chair, sat down, held his breath, and for the first time in years, he felt no weight on his chest. It was quiet, but not lonely. Memories sat with him. The way they loved, the time they shared, the warmth of her touch, the fire of old nights. He thought of what the past 10 years could have been. If only he'd forgiven her sooner. But time doesn't go back. And maybe it doesn't need to.